Historians have noted that the most catastrophic decisions in history were often triggered not by military necessity or political calculation, but by a leader's wounded pride. The psychology of narcissistic injury in heads of state has cost millions of lives. Here's what nobody tells you in history class. We talk about wars as if they were chess moves, strategic, calculated, rational. We talk about genocide as if it were ideology alone. We talk about purges as if they were purely political. But again and again, when you go back to the primary sources, the letters, the witness, accounts, the documented moments right before catastrophe, you find the same thing, sitting at the center of it all. Someone made the leader feel small, not metaphorically, literally, a slight, an insult, a public humiliation, a refusal to bow. And then, millions of people paid for it. Today we're going to break down the psychological mechanism behind this pattern, and then we're going to walk through three of the most devastating examples in history. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There's a term in clinical psychology called narcissistic injury. It refers to what happens when someone with narcissistic traits, an inflated sense of self, a deep need for admiration, and a fragile underlying identity, experiences a perceived attack on their status or ego. And the key word there is perceived, because narcissistic injury doesn't require an actual insult, it just requires that the person feels insulted, disrespected, overlooked, diminished. For most people, that feeling is uncomfortable. You might sulk, argue, maybe hold a grudge, but you move on. For someone with significant narcissistic traits who also happens to hold absolute power, that feeling becomes a mandate. It becomes justification. It becomes the emotional permission slip to do whatever comes next. Psychologists describe narcissistic rage as one of the most dangerous emotional states a human being can enter. It bypasses rational thought. It's not about solving a problem. It's about erasing the source of the humiliation, whatever that takes. Now put that psychology in a person with an army, with a secret police, with nuclear weapons, and suddenly, a bruised ego isn't just a personal problem. It's a geopolitical event. Example 1. Adolf Hitler. Let's start with the most studied case in modern history. Adolf Hitler's defining psychological wound is well documented. Repeated public rejection. Rejected from art school twice. Dismissed by the Viennese establishment. Treated as a nobody from a small Austrian town trying to break into a world that didn't want him. Most historians point to these rejections as formative, but what's less discussed is how directly his policies of persecution mapped onto the people and institutions he felt had humiliated him. The cosmopolitan Viennese intellectual class that had dismissed him, the press that had mocked him, the political figures who laughed at him in his early years. His closest aide, Albert Speer, wrote that Hitler had an almost physical revulsion toward being laughed at. Any form of mockery, even private, even second-hand, would send him into sustained rage. When Czechoslovakia's president Emil Hucha failed to show the level of deference Hitler expected during their 1939 meeting, Hitler reportedly flew into a fury and escalated his plans for invasion within hours. This wasn't geopolitics. This was a man who could not tolerate feeling disrespected, and 60 million people died in the war that followed. Example 2. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin came from genuine poverty and genuine humiliation. Born in a small Georgian town, beaten regularly by his father, mocked for his small, pockmarked face and his withered arm, dismissed for years within revolutionary circles as a provincial nobody compared to the intellectual titans around him. He never forgot any of it. The Great Purge of the late 1930s, in which somewhere between 700,000 and 1.2 million Soviet citizens were executed, was not primarily a strategic military decision. It was a systematic elimination of anyone Stalin perceived as having looked down on him, doubted him, or threatened to outshine him. Old Bolsheviks who had known him before he had power, people who remembered when he was nobody, were among the first to go. His own generals, his former allies, anyone who carried a memory of Stalin as less than supreme. Historian Robert Conquest documented this pattern in forensic detail. Stalin's purge lists were often personal, annotated in his own handwriting. He didn't just want people dead, he wanted to erase the witnesses to his humiliation. That is narcissistic injury operating at the scale of a nation. Example 3. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 is typically taught as an oil oil grab, a strategic land play. But people who studied Saddam up close, including CIA analysts and Arab diplomats who negotiated with him, consistently describe a man who was pathologically fixated on status and respect, who viewed any slight, any challenge to his authority as a personal attack, requiring a devastating response. In the lead-up to the invasion, Kuwait had been exceeding its OPEC oil quota, driving down prices and directly damaging Iraq's post-war economy. Saddam raised this issue repeatedly in diplomatic meetings. Kuwait's response, casual, dismissive, sometimes borderline, contemptuous, was by multiple accounts delivered with a tone that made Saddam feel publicly disrespected. Former U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie, who met with Saddam just days before the invasion, later noted that his fury wasn't primarily economic. It was about having been treated as a lesser, as someone whose warnings could be ignored. He invaded 8 days later. The Gulf War, the sanctions, the suffering of the Iraqi people for the decade that followed, rooted in no small part in a diplomatic slight that made the wrong man feel small. 3 men, 3 different countries, 3 different eras, 3 entirely different ideological frameworks, same trigger. And this pattern doesn't stop with these 3. You can trace it through Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, launched in part as a response to internal party critics who had questioned his judgment, through Idi Amin's expulsions and purges, frequently triggered by perceived personal disrespect from foreign leaders or domestic rivals, through Kim Jong-il's provocations, so often timed to moments when North Korea felt ignored or sidelined on the world stage. The ideology changes, the century changes, the geography changes, the wounded ego stays constant. Here's what I want you to take away from this. These weren't irrational men in the sense that they had no reasoning. They had plenty of reasoning. They were capable of long-term planning, political maneuvering, and strategic thinking. But underneath all of that was a psychological fault line that, when triggered, overrode everything else. And because they held power, there was no mechanism to stop them. No one around them willing or able to say, this isn't about strategy anymore. This is about your ego. That's the real lesson here. Not that these men were uniquely evil, but that unchecked power in a person with a fragile identity is one of the most reliably dangerous combinations in human history. It happened before these 3. It's happening somewhere right now, and it will happen again unless we understand the mechanism well enough to recognize it in time. If this kind of deep psychological history is your thing, I've got another video right here that goes even further down the rabbit hole. And if you're new, subscribe. We dig into this stuff every single week. See you in the next one.